Imagine your life being turned upside down by the one person you thought you could trust, your brother. What would you do if he ruined your life, betrayed your trust, and then turned to you for help when everything falls apart? And what if he got your wife pregnant in the process? Now, with a $2 million inheritance at stake, this twisted family drama reaches its breaking point. How far would you go for someone who's done nothing but destroy you? David, a 30-year-old software engineer, had always been the steady, responsible one in the family. He had a stable career, a comfortable home, and a loving wife, Sarah, whom he had been married to for 5 years. Life for David was orderly. But things began to unravel when Chris, his 28-year-old younger brother, came back into the picture. Chris had always been the wild one, carefree, reckless, and constantly making impulsive decisions that left their family picking up the pieces. He'd dropped out of college to pursue a career as a freelance photographer, but his ventures were always unprofitable. He had little to no direction, constantly bouncing from one job to the next, leaving a trail of failed opportunities behind him. David had always tried to help his brother, hoping he would get his act together, but each attempt was met with resistance and excuses. Their parents, Robert and Marie, had always favored David for his responsible nature, while Chris seemed to get away with everything. This constant comparison between the two brothers had created a growing rift between them. David's parents saw him as the golden child, the one who would inherit their real estate empire, a business they had spent decades building. Chris, on the other hand, was often dismissed, his talents and efforts unrecognized by the family. David loved his family, but he could never shake the feeling that something was off. He had always been the one to hold things together, to make sure everyone was happy, even at his own expense. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew that one day, the tension between him and Chris would reach a breaking point. That day came sooner than he expected. The calm facade of David's life began to crack when Chris, needing money and a place to stay, moved back in with their parents. His chaotic presence once again disrupted the delicate balance David had worked so hard to maintain. Little did David know that the storm was just beginning. Things began to spiral when David's wife, Sarah, started spending more time with Chris. She felt sorry for him. He was always charming, disarming with his carefree attitude. David, ever the protector of his family, never imagined that the brother he had been so protective of could ever betray him in the worst way possible. David's life took a turn he never could have anticipated when he received an anonymous message that night, an image that shattered everything. His wife, Sarah, was in bed with Chris. The image was a devastating blow, and the betrayal cut deep. David's heart raced as he stood frozen, staring at the image on his phone. His world spun out of control. Was this real? It couldn't be. He thought he had everything under control. Sarah was his soulmate, the woman he had built a life with. But now, in one horrifying moment, it felt like everything was falling apart. He couldn't breathe. His brother, his flesh and blood, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. David immediately confronted Sarah. Her face paled and guilt washed over her. She tried to explain, but the words were hollow. She claimed it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, but the damage had already been done. She couldn't take back what had happened. As the conversation unfolded, David's anger and hurt became unbearable. Sarah was pregnant, and the child she carried, his brother's child, was the ultimate betrayal. The trust they had built their marriage on had crumbled. How could he ever look at her the same way again? How could they ever rebuild their life together when the foundation had been completely shattered? That night, David's world came crashing down. Sarah was remorseful, but her actions could never be erased. They were irreversible. His marriage was now at a breaking point, and all David could feel was the heavy weight of betrayal. David confronted Chris the next day. Chris, as expected, was unapologetic. He acted as though the affair didn't matter, as if it was just another one of his reckless decisions. His lack of remorse infuriated David even more. Chris had crossed a line that was unforgivable. The betrayal wasn't just about Sarah. Chris had destroyed their bond as brothers, forever altering the relationship they had. In the aftermath, their parents, Robert and Marie, were disgusted by Chris' actions. They couldn't believe that their son, who had always been the wild one, could stoop so low. The family's response was swift. They disowned Chris, cutting him off completely. David, however, was left in the midst of a mess he never imagined. His brother was now out of their lives, but the emotional scar would stay forever. David's heart was heavy as he struggled to process the events. His marriage was in turmoil, his brother was gone, and everything he had worked for his stable life, his career, felt meaningless in the face of this betrayal. But as much as David wanted to flee from the pain, there was one thing he couldn't escape: the inheritance. His parents had left him their $2 million estate. David, still reeling from the betrayal, now had to contend with the reality of inheriting a fortune that felt more like a curse. How could he move forward? Could he rebuild his life with Sarah, or was this the end of their marriage? David was stunned when he received the news that their parents had disowned Chris. His mind was still reeling from the affair, the betrayal, and now the weight of an inheritance he had never asked for. The family real estate empire, their house, the savings, all of it now belonged to him, but it came at an emotional cost that he wasn't sure he could bear. For years, David had lived his life trying to please his parents, to live up to the expectations they had set for him. He had worked hard, always doing the right thing, and now they had left him their legacy. But the inheritance was far from a blessing. The idea of accepting it felt like a knife in his gut. His parents' choice to leave him everything, while disowning Chris, made him feel as though he was being forced into a role he wasn't sure he wanted. The money was significant: $2 million, all the property, the businesses, but it wasn't just about the wealth. It was about the expectations that came with it. David had to take on the responsibility of running the family empire, something he had never asked for, and something that would tie him even more tightly to the family he was now distanced from. What made this even more complicated was Chris. Even though they had disowned him, David couldn't shake the feeling that his brother would eventually come back looking for help, for forgiveness, or worse, for the money. Chris had always been a manipulator, able to charm his way into getting what he wanted. But now, David was in a position where he had to decide: would he give Chris a second chance, or would he close the door on him completely? David's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The inheritance felt like a cruel reminder of everything that had gone wrong in his life. He could have it all: money, power, influence, but it was at the cost of his relationship with his brother and his parents. Would he be able to live with that? As days passed, David found himself in a constant internal battle. He knew that he couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but he also knew that taking the inheritance might mean losing the last shred of his peace. The weight of his decision hung over him like a storm cloud, threatening to engulf everything in its path. But there was one thing David knew for certain: this was a turning point. Whatever decision he made would shape the rest of his life. Just when David thought he had escaped the chaos, Chris returned, just like he had done countless times before. But this time, there was something different in his demeanor. His usual charm was replaced by desperation. His eyes were hollow, his voice shaky as he stood on David's doorstep, looking more like a man broken by life than the carefree younger brother David once knew. "I need your help," Chris said, his voice cracking. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please, I have nowhere else to go." David stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the plea in Chris' voice, but it felt like a trap. Chris had hurt him before. He had torn apart their family, betrayed David in the worst possible way. And now, after everything, he was standing here, expecting forgiveness, expecting David to open the door. "I don't know if I can do this," David finally said, his voice low and cold. "You've destroyed everything. Our family, my marriage. I'm done being your safety net." But Chris didn't back down. "I don't expect you to forget what I did. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but I need help. I made mistakes, but I'm trying to change." David stood there, unsure of what to do. He could see the desperation in his brother's eyes. Was this real? Was Chris truly trying to change, or was he simply trying to manipulate David again? The truth was, David didn't know. But what he did know was that Chris had caused so much destruction in their lives, and this time David wasn't sure he had the strength to save him. The decision wasn't easy. Chris had no one left, and he was facing serious financial ruin. His business had collapsed, and the money he had squandered was gone. But David wasn't the same person he once was. He had worked too hard to build his own life, his own happiness, and he couldn't let Chris pull him back into his chaotic world. David's anger flared as memories of the affair, the betrayal, and the pain flooded back. But there was also a small voice in his head that told him to listen, to give Chris a chance, even if it meant risking more heartache. For the first time, David was confronted with the reality that family wasn't something you could simply walk away from. He had already closed the door on his brother once. Could he do it again? The days that followed Chris' arrival were filled with an emotional tug-of-war for David. His mind and heart were at odds. The anger, resentment, and betrayal that had accumulated over the years made it hard for David to even look at Chris without feeling a rush of bitterness. But deep down, he knew that forgiving Chris was the only way he could ever heal from the scars of the past. David had always prided himself on being the bigger person, the one who could see the potential in others and give them the benefit of the doubt. But this situation was different. Chris had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, tearing apart everything David had worked so hard to build: his trust, his marriage, his peace of mind. How could he simply forgive that? How could he let go of the pain when it was so fresh? But as the days passed, David found himself reflecting on the years of disappointment and failure that Chris had faced. He had watched his brother struggle, sabotage himself, and distance everyone around him. It was as if Chris had always been searching for something: validation, love, or perhaps redemption, but he had never found it in a healthy way. And yet here Chris was, standing in front of David, asking for a chance, for help. David's heart softened, just a little, as he thought about the kind of life Chris had lived, one of chaos and missed opportunities. Could he really close the door on his brother for good? As much as David wanted to scream, to tell Chris to leave and never come back, something inside of him whispered that this was his chance to break the cycle, to be the brother that Chris had never had. But the cost was high. Forgiving Chris meant opening himself up to the possibility of being hurt again. It meant acknowledging that the past couldn't be erased, but it could be redefined. David spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. Should he offer Chris the help he so desperately needed, or should he walk away for good and let him face the consequences of his actions alone? The pain of their past was overwhelming, but the idea of forgiveness, though terrifying, offered a flicker of hope. David wasn't sure if he could forgive his brother yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't live in a place of constant anger. Forgiveness was not about forgetting, it was about moving forward, and for David, it was the only way to find peace. After days of emotional turmoil, David finally decided that he couldn't leave Chris hanging. Despite the intense bitterness and pain, he agreed to offer his brother a lifeline. But it wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be without conditions. David knew that giving Chris a chance meant setting boundaries that Chris would have to respect, or else David would walk away for good. David's offer was simple but firm. "I'll help you, Chris," David said one evening as they sat in his living room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "But you have to do this the right way. You need to go to therapy, get a job, and prove that you can be responsible. I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing this for me. If you can show me that you're serious about turning your life around, then we'll talk." Chris looked at David, his expression a mix of hope and fear. This wasn't the kind of offer he had expected. He was used to David swooping in and bailing him out, but this time was different. David wasn't just offering money or a place to stay, he was offering a chance at a new life, but only if Chris was willing to put in the work. At first, Chris seemed overwhelmed, unsure if he was ready to face the challenges that David was laying out. For a moment, it looked like he might walk away, just like he always had when things got difficult. But then something shifted in Chris. He looked at David, his eyes no longer filled with arrogance or indifference, but with a quiet desperation. "I'll do it," he said, his voice unsteady. "I'll do whatever it takes. I know I messed up. I just need a chance." David nodded, Though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen, he was cautious, unwilling to trust too easily. Chris had failed him too many times before. But for the first time in a long while, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, his brother was ready to change. This wasn't going to be easy, and David knew that it might not end well. But offering Chris this opportunity was David's way of letting go of the anger that had held him hostage for so long. He wasn't doing it for Chris, he was doing it for himself, for the chance to find peace, and for the chance to move on from the past. David watched Chris with a mix of hope and skepticism over the next few weeks. Chris had agreed to the terms therapy, finding a job, and proving his worth, and David was cautiously optimistic. For the first time in years, Chris was showing up on time for their meetings, going to therapy, and even applying for jobs. David could see the effort, and it stirred something within him, a flicker of the brother he used to know. But the doubt still lingered. Was Chris truly changing, or was this just another act in his endless cycle of manipulation? David kept a close eye on him, noticing the small details, the way Chris would smile through his pain, or the way his eyes would quickly dart away when the topic of trust came up. There was a part of David that wanted to believe in his brother, to see the good that had always been buried beneath his reckless behavior. But another part of him feared that Chris was simply playing the role he needed to in order to get what he wanted. One night, David came home early from work to find Chris in his office, on the phone. David couldn't help but overhear part of the conversation as he walked by. Chris was speaking in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Yeah, I know it's risky, but he'll buy it. I've got him right where I want him. Once I'm in, I'll have access to everything." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth: Chris was manipulating him once again. The whole change routine had been an act. Chris wasn't trying to better himself, he was trying to get his hands on the inheritance, on the family wealth that David now controlled. David stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to confront Chris right then and there. His mind raced with a mix of fury and disbelief. How could Chris do this to him again? How could he have fallen for it? After everything, after the affair, after being cut off by their parents, Chris was still trying to manipulate him. But David wasn't going to let his brother win this time. He wasn't going to let himself be played again. The betrayal stung harder than the last one, but this time David had the power. He wasn't the naive younger brother anymore. He was the one in control, and he wasn't about to let Chris ruin everything he had worked for. The next day, David confronted Chris, not with anger, but with cold determination. "I know what you're doing," David said, his voice steady. "You're not fooling me anymore. You were never interested in changing. You just wanted my money, and I'm done." Chris's face drained of color, and for a brief moment, David saw the true extent of his brother's desperation. "Please," David, Chris pleaded. I was trying to get better. I need this." But David was resolute. "No, you don't need my money. You need to take responsibility for your actions, and I won't enable you anymore." It was the hardest thing David had ever done. He had hoped, even briefly, that Chris could change. But this was the wake-up call David needed. His brother had crossed a line, and there was no going back. David thought he had seen the last of Chris's manipulation, but the twist in the story was far from over. As he prepared to cut ties with his brother for good, David received an unexpected phone call. It was from the attorney handling his parents' estate, the very same inheritance that had been the root of all the turmoil. "David, there's something you need to know," the attorney said, his voice tense. "There's a clause in your parents' will that changes everything." David's heart dropped as the attorney revealed the shocking truth: Chris wasn't completely disinherited. The will had a contingency plan that allowed Chris to inherit a portion of the estate if he completed certain conditions that Chris had secretly fulfilled by going to therapy, applying for jobs, and appearing to turn his life around. David was stunned. He hadn't known about this clause. His parents had kept it hidden, believing that Chris would never meet the criteria. But now, with Chris having followed through on the conditions, the inheritance was split. Chris was entitled to a sizable portion of the $2 million estate. David felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about his parents, about his family had been a lie. His parents had given Chris one last chance, even after all the damage he had caused. Was this their way of redeeming him, or had they simply been naive? David was torn. He had just confronted Chris about his manipulation, but now it seemed that Chris had, in some twisted way, earned a piece of the fortune. David didn't want to be the one to give it to him. But legally, he had no choice. The clause was clear. The realization hit David hard. His brother, despite everything, was entitled to a share of the legacy. And in that moment, David had to make a choice. Would he honor his parents' wishes and share the inheritance, or would he fight Chris and risk tearing the family apart even further? David was torn between anger and duty, but as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, he knew there was no turning back. The legacy of their family, the fortune that had torn them apart, was now a burden that both brothers had to carry. The real question was, could David ever truly forgive Chris, and could they both move forward from the wreckage of their past? David couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was now slipping through his fingers. The inheritance, which should have been a symbol of his hard-earned success, had instead become a reminder of the chaos his family had endured. The knowledge that Chris was entitled to a share of the estate gnawed at him like an insidious parasite. How could he, after everything, hand over a part of what was rightfully his? But the law was clear. His parents had made a final decision, and as painful as it was, David couldn't escape the reality. If he fought the inheritance clause, it would only result in prolonged legal battles, leaving the estate in limbo, possibly causing more harm to everyone involved. Chris would get his share, regardless of whether David agreed to it or not. But could David really bring himself to accept it? David stood in the study, staring at the family documents, his parents' will, their final wishes, their signatures. They had always trusted him, expected him to be the responsible one, the one who would carry on the family legacy. And now that legacy was fractured. He had once imagined a future where he would run the family business with dignity, building something that would last. Now he wondered whether that future was even possible, with Chris's claim hanging over him like a dark cloud. He could feel his resentment toward his brother building again. After everything, Chris's betrayal, his reckless lifestyle, his manipulation, why did he deserve anything? But David also knew that life wasn't about holding on to bitterness. He had to choose peace, even if it meant making the hardest decision of his life. With a heavy heart, David made the call to Chris. His voice was cold, detached, but inside he was struggling with the emotional weight of his decision. Chris, David said, after a long pause, "I know about the clause, and I'll honor it. You'll get your share of the inheritance." There was silence on the other end of the line. David could hear Chris's breathing, almost as if he didn't believe it. "David, you're serious?" Chris finally asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "I'm serious," David replied, his voice unwavering. "But don't think this means everything is forgiven. We have a long way to go." Chris didn't respond immediately. David could sense the mix of relief and guilt in his brother's tone when he finally said, "Thank you. I won't waste it, David. I swear." David hung up the phone, his heart heavy with the burden of his decision. He had made a choice to honor his parents' wishes, but it wasn't a choice he felt good about. It was a choice made out of duty, not out of love. He wasn't sure if he would ever forgive Chris completely. But for now, he had done what he felt was right. As time passed, the weight of the inheritance decision slowly began to settle. David continued with his life, his business, and his efforts to rebuild after all the damage that had been done. He tried to focus on his marriage, on the future he had with his wife, and on the healing he needed. But there was always the looming question, could David and Chris ever move on from the past? Months had passed since David handed over the inheritance, and for the first time, Chris seemed to be keeping his word. He was working, paying off his debts, and staying out of trouble. But David knew that forgiveness didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, painful process, and even though his brother was trying, David wasn't sure if he was ready to fully trust him again. Trust had been shattered too many times. One evening, as David sat in his office, there was a knock at the door. It was Chris, standing hesitantly in the doorway, looking different. Gone was the cocky, entitled man he had once been. In his place stood someone more vulnerable, more human. "I just wanted to thank you, David," Chris said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I know I've messed up, but I'm trying to fix things. I'm trying to be better, and I owe it to you." David sat back in his chair, staring at his brother. He didn't know what to say. Chris's words were sincere, but the past still hung between them like a wall neither of them could break down. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," David admitted, his voice quiet, "but I'm willing to try. For the sake of moving forward." Chris nodded slowly, the weight of David's words sinking in. "That's all I can ask for." The brothers stood there in silence for a moment, each knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. David had made his peace with the inheritance. Now it was time to make peace with his brother. But the question remained, could they both truly move forward, or was the past too powerful to overcome? What do you think? Can David and Chris rebuild their relationship, or is it too late? Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to find out if these two brothers can ever truly heal.